recording.
Okay.
5, 4, 3.
I'm going to say a little intro. It's Tuesday, June 11th, 2024. This is Mei Li and Karen Wang. Mei Li, I'm a faculty in Intercultural Studies, Ethnic Studies, and also Chair of Asian American and Asian Studies at Anza. Karen Wang is a research intern with the Asian American Studies program here. Today we are interviewing Connie Young Yu at Anza College in Cupertino as part of the NEH grant on Asian American storytelling in the Santa Clara Valley. And I just want to mention we have a tech crew here of Jiwan Zhang. Karen Wang's also on tech crew, Lori Clinchard, and Ed Bro. So with that, we'll start asking you the first question. Your work, we've listened to the life history that you interview with Yvonne and review some of your work, and we know that a lot of your work is meant to tell the untold stories of the Chinese American experience, and it spans decades. Your work spans decades. And it's included writing, speaking, advising, advocacy, institution building, and community organizing. Can you tell us how your own consciousness as a Chinese American or an Asian American developed, how that consciousness developed, and how it has informed your work over all these decades?
Yes, well, certainly lofty credits there. Yes, well, I was very fortunate, and I keep reflecting on this, when people ask who inspired you most, who are your mentors, it was my parents. My father, who was born in 1912 in the Chinatown it's called Highlandville, and my mother, born in San Francisco in 1908, and she told me stories of her ancestors that I always knew, and I'm very fortunate in this way, I always knew that my great-grandfather worked on the Transcontinental Railroad, because she was very proud of it. She always said, you're going to do something, but don't forget the pioneers, and do something for women. And it's interesting because, you think about Asian American parents as pushing their kids, to be, doctors and engineers or something, accountants, and so, but my sister, 3 years older than I, and my brother, 5 years younger, all three of us were encouraged to do whatever we thought we could be, that we loved, and that we could follow our dream. But, and my father was a Chinatown leader. He was a colonel in the U.S. Reserves, and Chinatown, San Francisco leader, community leader with the Chinese Chamber of Commerce, and he spearheaded the move to create the War Memorial at St. Mary's Square to Chinese Americans who made the ultimate sacrifice in World Wars I and World War II. So I grew up seeing my father and my mother, and she was very active in more like collecting antiques and robes and documents and things that related to our history. She just did that. And people have said, your parents, you're a historian because your parents are pack rats. But the thing is, I grew up with that. But when I went to Mills College, and this is true for going to other universities, and the first course you take is a Western Civ. It's a requirement. You can't graduate, and ours was great books, and of course, starts with Socrates, But so I always knew I wanted to be a writer, but to succeed in college, with this culture, this Western culture, you have to go with it and see and be excited about it. And I was. I loved English literature, and I loved. What saved me was working on the school newspaper, journalism, and one of my first reports was on the House on Un-American Activities demonstrations at City Hall in 1961. It was 1960 in this, where, students protested, the House on Un-American Activities. I was there reporting, and I saw one of my high school friends saying, "Oh, today I'm ashamed to be an American," and it really kind of stunned me. He was a white guy, and of course I always identified with. I always had a strong feeling of being Chinese American because our culture was Chinatown, San Francisco. We were so proud of it. Without the culture of our parades and our, the monuments and the festivities, even Miss Chinatown USA gave us a sense of pride and identity. So I was proud of that. But it's nothing that I could convey or have other people share when I went to college. There was very few people of color. There was no black people in my class, and only a couple of Asians, few Asian. So anyway, I was an okay student. I excelled in writing poetry. I wanted to be a creative writer. And then in my senior year, where we had a senior seminar, and it was a senior seminar on Mark Twain. And my professor, Dr. Franklin Walker, was assigning topics. Everybody, this is your senior thesis. You're going to write something relating to Mark Twain, like Mark Twain, some aspect of his work. And I was the only person of color in the room. And when it came to me, I said, well, I'd like to write about Mark Twain in the short story. And the teacher looked right at me and said, how about writing about Mark Twain and the Chinese? Mm-hmm. And I just sat back and I was kind of stunned. And one of my friends said, oh, I'm so surprised he said that to you. It's like I was being discriminated against, that I could only... But what he did was the biggest favor of my life. So I wrote my thesis on Mark Twain and the Chinese, and I did research on how Mark Twain was an advocate for the Chinese, how he was a cub reporter, and writing about the, brutality toward a Chinese, and the editor, tossed his story saying, you're going to offend the Irish readers. And Mark Twain decided he would write about the Chinese and satirical articles and a wonderful story. So anyway, reading about him and also about the Burlingame Treaty and all the other, anti-Chinese laws and anti-Chinese movement, and the fact that Mark Twain wrote so much about the Chinese, it was, I got an A-. So, but it suddenly connected me to the history that I always felt and knew about. And here it was, I was in this college that it was connected to a famous American writer, one of the, the greatest cultural, icons of American literature. So it was, later on I wrote an article for Chinatown, a Chinatown booklet, and it was Mark Twain and Chinatown. Mm-hmm. So and then my parents were so proud, but I didn't associate at all with their experiences or their parents' experiences. What I did know about racism and discrimination was the fact that we moved out of Chinatown to the Richmond district, and a small middle class neighborhood, small middle class home in an all-white neighborhood, because my father was able to have his Army buddy, a fellow reserve officer of the same rank, lieutenant colonel, buy the house first and then sell it to us. And we became the first Chinese in that whole area of the Richmond district, 37, the avenues. Mm-hmm. And we were blockbusters. And I had no idea that my neighbor, whom I loved, I won't say her name, Mrs. Dear One, who was a friendly neighbor to me, and until my mother told me years and years later, the person who circulated a petition against the Chinese against our moving in was Mrs. Dear One, you know? And I go, I can't believe it. And so it just showed me that the fears that people had about Chinese, and the stereotypes, that they thought a Chinese family would move in and start a Tong war, but once they saw us, and then my father being a reserve officer and all that, and businessman and respectable, and the cute little kids. And we were the only, my sister, brother, and I were the only Chinese kids when we first moved in at Lafayette Grammar School. Mm-hmm. So, but once we were there, it was just, I felt really very happy. You know, I didn't feel the discrimination, except once in a while. You know, you always feel you're different. Mm-hmm. But in high school, I think I became, this is the first time, this is Washington High School, and there are a lot of, you know, Asians, African American kids, large, my friends were Jewish Americans, and they were very activists, and I learned from them about the Anti-Defamation League. And one of them, Alice Huberman, invited me to speak at her temple. It was B'nai B'rith, on prejudice. In those days, they talked about prejudice, not racism. And so I spoke as a Chinese, and there was an African-American woman who spoke as, you know, and then I don't know at that time if there was a Latino, but we all spoke about, you know, what it felt like to be, what our civics teacher called us, hyphenated Americans. Because I remember when he used that term, I said, what's a hyphenated American? And he looked at me and he goes, well, like a Chinese American. And then I thought, that's kind of, you know. But anyway, I went to Mills College. You heard about my experience there. And then when I graduated, I got married right away to Dr. John Yu, who grew up in the Philippines, born in Shanghai, but went to Stanford Medical School, was very, very a true humanitarian, and was very interested in all these things. So we had, when I was 27, I already had 3 children under 5. I got married at 21, so anyway, and I was very, I think by then, busy as I was with the family, and I loved, you know, being with, I loved the family, loved being, you know, the housewife, the mother, activist, because I was so inspired by the civil rights movement, and also extremely emotionally involved with the anti-war movement, and seeing what was happening in Vietnam. I mean, it was just, you know, it's hard to imagine now, but every day you'd see the news of American soldiers fighting Vietnamese in the news, you know, during the late 60s and then 70s, Kent State, where students were shot protesting. And anyway, my son Martin was born in September of 1969, and I named him after Martin Luther King, because that was the year the Tet Offensive, Martin Luther King was assassinated, Robert Kennedy was assassinated. It seemed like the war would not end. The war would not end unless there was just, you know, huge domestic unrest and protests and demonstrations. The people had to be the conscience of the country, like now, like the students now with the genocide in Gaza. So when we moved to Los Altos Hills in 1970, I met some fellow peaceniks there. It's really interesting because at that time it was very rural, and then the local peace center was in Palo Alto, and I helped. I worked with some friends, and everybody was white at that time, you know, in the peace movement. I worked with them to form an organization called the Peace Union, which met there, and we organized demonstrations. We supported the demonstrations at Stanford, and that's where I met Asian American radicals for the first time. And it was very, very exciting to see, because what they were demonstrating was against the racism of the war, the imperialism of the war, the making connections between the struggles at home and the struggles abroad. And, you know, and I took up the chant, one struggle, many fronts. And the Third World Movement, what was it? The people united will never be divided. You know, I was out there, and I was very good at writing leaflets. So I had kind of started giving up on creative writing, because it was just like, this is the need. This is what has to be done. And I started writing essays and newsletters, and then that led to, well, I also wrote an article on, this is getting back to close to my parents' narrative, you know. They were going to go to the 100th anniversary of the Golden Spike. This is the 100th anniversary of the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad at Promontory Point. And my father was vice president of the Chinese Historical Society of America. Philip Choi was the president. And Philip was invited to give the keynote speech. He was invited to give a speech, let's say, not the keynote. And I knew all this was happening, and I thought, I'm going to write an article. And that's when I started doing research, deep research into the Transcontinental Railroad. And I found out all about the anti-Chinese movement and the struggle, and the fact that the railroad workers, after they completed the job, they tried to find work elsewhere, and they were driven out of town. There was violence, and, you know, finding that out. But what I wrote was the story, and it was on the incredible achievement of Chinese that has been ignored. And so it was called The Unsung Heroes of the Golden Spike. And I did a lot of my research at the graduate. I bought a special pass. At the graduate school at library at Stanford, and I was able to go through the stacks and read the newspapers of the time, and I really got excited about it and shared that with my parents. My article was published May 10th, 1969, and I was at home with the kids, and my parents were in Promontory. And at that moment, you know, of the dedication of, you know, the Golden Spike and the meeting of the rails, the grand speech by the Secretary of Transportation, John Volpe, Phil Choi was supposed to go up and present a plaque. And it was to Chinese, you know, in honoring Chinese railroad workers. It was presented by the Chinese community of San Francisco, and so, and the Chinese Historical Society. So he's there, and at the last minute, just when he was about to go up, the chairperson of the event, Mr. Goodfellow, of all things, came up and said, "Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Choi, there's no time for you." And that snub, you know, created a movement, especially after John Volpe gave the speech saying, who but Americans could have tunneled through, you know, so the granite through the Sierras. Who but Americans could have built 10 miles of track in one day? That was the keynote. And so, and Phil Choi was just furious, and there were only 5 Chinese at that time, out of 20,000 people. My mother was the only descendant of a Chinese railroad worker there. And she just sat there, and my parents were very polite, you know, and they also, Phil was furious. He said he wanted to go up and grab the microphone, but, you know, they pulled it off. But they told me later what it was like, and it took, let's say, there was quite a movement in Chinatown. In those days, you know, there's no cell phones. The news didn't come for that until a couple of days, when there was an article in the Chronicle called the Forgotten Men of the Golden Spike, and it told the story of how Phil Choi was totally ignored and could not give the dedication speech, give the commemorative speech to Chinese railroad workers, which he had been waiting so long to do. And for the Chinese Historical Society, he felt he had failed our people. So many, many decades later, in 2019, May 10th, I was invited to give the commencement address. And, you know, I was wearing my mother's dress, Chinese dress, and up to the last minute, I was so, let's say, anxious, maybe a paranoid, that somebody would come up and say, "Sorry, Ms. Yu, there's no time for you." But I saw my name on the program. It was, you know, the great event poster, you know, and I was right there, you know, Connie Yu, Chinese Historical Society commencement. And then there was a lion dance, and then, you know, and the Secretary of Transportation was Elaine Chao. Well, you know, of course she had wonderful speech written for her, you know, commemorating everybody. But I was able to talk about, to give the speech about reclaiming history and also honoring all the immigrant workers, but particularly mentioning that the Chinese were excluded because of the Chinese exclusion law, the anti-Chinese movement, and written out of history. And this was a moment to reclaim it, but reclaim it for America, not just, you know, our group. So anyway, so that was a great, how do you say, a milestone. And also I felt it was a mission accomplished. But of course, right afterwards, you know, it was, we had the Chinese Descendants Association had a real, you know, big celebration, you know, luncheon, and Judge Michael Kwan stood up, you know, he said, "I want to read something that I got off of Facebook or, you know, social media." And he goes like, "You Chinese crybabies, you know, what do you think? America owes you everything? You know, why don't you go back to where you came from?" That was it. And I just thought, oh my God, you know, this is a nativist country, you know, this, you know, it's such a, it will always be a constant struggle. It'll be a constant struggle to show that we're not perpetual aliens. It's so deeply entrenched. Well, anyway, but in between the first, you know, the 100-year commemoration, the 150th, you know, I did a lot of writing and work, and the writing that I've done, it's not always, you know, I wrote a couple of books and a lot of articles. I never was an academician, you know, so I was always, I called myself an independent historian. But a real milestone for me was getting involved in, like, the first Asian American Writers Conference, the first Asian American issue of Concerned Asian Scholars. And it's funny, my husband said, 2 out of 3 ain't bad. You're concerned, and you're concerned and you're Asian. But anyway, I was finally able to connect, make the connections between the history that I was reading about Mark Twain and my own family history. And the cover of this is my grandfather's Chokji. It's a certificate of residence that he was required to carry because of the Geary Act. And it's stamped laborer. That's my grandfather. And so this was a special issue, and the editors are Sean Wang, Professor John, who's now a professor. He was 23 years old at the time, and a young writer, and me. So so it's sort of established that with Asian American studies, Asian American the culture. It's the people's history. It's all oral history. It didn't come out of libraries. You know, we will put it in the libraries, but we're the ones who have to write it. And
Can
so,
I ask you some questions?
Yes.
Kind of about the many things that you've talked about. And so it sounds like, you know, as you were saying, you were growing up and your parents conveyed a lot of pride and kind of inculcated that in you
Yes.
in Chinese American family and culture. And then, you know, you went to school at Mills, and then you studied Mark Twain and his writings, you know, in support of Chinese Americans. And then later on, you did your own research on transcontinental railroad and Chinese Americans and started writing. I'm curious, like when your parents were telling you you were growing up, did they share, was there emphasis on being Chinese American, prideful? Was it linked to stories about racism and discrimination, or not? Later on, you kind of found the context of that to understand.
yes,
You know what I mean?
yes, about how my parents would link the,
Yeah.
you know, the struggles with, you know, their experiences and their ancestors. Well, they didn't talk about it in the angry, bitter way, but they'd always say, and I always would hear this, that my grandfather came to San Jose at the age of 11 with his uncle as a 11-year-old laborer in 1881, 1 year before the Chinese exclusion law. And my father would say, you know, if he waited till he was 12, he wouldn't be able to come, because the exclusion law would have been passed, and Chinese laborers would not be. He came, and because he came before, he was even able to get a re-entry permit if he go back to China. That's how he could bring over my grandmother after he became a merchant. But anyway, the key thing was my father talked about Chinese exclusion, and he would always talk about how the Chinese were treated, but he would say, Yam Gong, you know, it's so pathetic, it's so Yam Gong, so sorrowful to see what happened to some of these Chinese workers, you know, and what happened to your grandfather. For instance, when my grandfather was in the Market Street Chinatown, you know, he did a lot of things. He worked as the 11-year-old laborer. He worked in the store, you know, helping the clan store. That he was a houseboy. Later, he worked with strawberry growers, picking strawberries. He made bricks. But whenever he would leave Chinatown, the perimeters of Chinatown, you know, he'd be really wary. And he told us one time, he said, when I ran home, back from work one time, I was chased by a bunch of white kids, you know, ruffians, you know. And he said, and I ran so fast, I lost my hat. That's all he said. He didn't say, he wasn't like, oh, those horrible, you know, blank, blank, blanks. You know, he just said, I lost my hat. And it seemed like it was part of being in America. And my father talked about, well, a lot of things. The fact that why he became a soy sauce manufacturer instead of an engineer. He wasn't an engineer for a company, not naming. They told him, you know, there's a glass ceiling here. You're not going to get very far. We don't hire Chinese permanently. And they just say Chinese because the Chinese exclusion law left such, and all the subsequent laws, left such a legalized mandate. You know, don't hire Chinese, don't include Chinese. You know, it became, even if they're citizens. So the next thing that I was very involved in, after this, and meeting the wonderful activists, Asian American activists, and this also was the first time I was involved with writing about Asian Americans, because we wrote about, Sean Wang and I wrote about the Japanese American concentration camp journal, Trek, at Topaz. So we did an essay on Japanese Americans You know, so that's when I interviewed my friends who were Japanese Americans for this article. And then the poetry, you have Sam Tagatak, Filipino American, Lawson Inada, Japanese, Sean Wang, Wing Tek Lum, Chinese, so Frank Chin. So, but their agenda and their anthology that they put together, the IE boys, was Asian Americans. And so that's when I got into the whole sensibility and made connections.
How would you say your sense of identity, if you were to compare it or its evolving nature, like before, you know, growing up and before you met these Asian American activists through Stanford and through kind of the peace organizing you were doing? How would you describe your sense of identity?
Well, I would feel that their history, other Asians' history, is separate from ours. You know, because I was so specialized. I didn't realize until working with them and the laws, and the fact that my grandmother was excluded from immigration because, and was, you know, on Angel Island for 15 months. Initially, because there was a law of 1924, there was really to stop Japanese picture brides, and it said, you know, no aliens ineligible for citizenship will be admitted to the United States. So I realized, you know, and also I was, okay, I'm wearing this T-shirt. I was on this was something that I couldn't believe would happen, to be in an organization, an activist organization that actually succeeded beyond our wildest dreams. So before that, to show you that I felt a lot of a defeat, I was a McGovern delegate in 1972, because from the peace movement, you know, McGovern was a peace candidate, you know. The other candidate was Nixon, whom my father supported because he was a Republican. And my father was, you know, when Nixon ran for senator, my father was the Chinatown Republican Party chairperson. So anyway, but my father was, see, my parents it's unconditional love. They were very proud of me being, you know, a delegate, national delegate. So this was revolutionary. The California delegation was composed of, you know, people 18 years old, you know, Asian Americans. There were only 6 Asian Americans in a delegation of over 100, you know, and George Takei was one of them. And so, you know, we just banded together, and we were accepted in the Chicano delegation. So that's when I got the idea of the solidarity of people of color. And they even called it third world people. They didn't know what to call us. But so that's when I just saw that we needed a little political clout. Norman Mineta was walking around there. He was mayor of, at that time, San Jose. Loved meeting Norman. And I met him, you know, he was very inspiring. And I interviewed him about his experience in camp when he was mayor. So, but just being involved with, changed my whole perception of history. And also, I was involved with a radio group, KPFA, also KPFA, where, you know, we had programs on Asian American, you know, activism. And another one started by Chinese for Affirmative Action, in which we formed a group called the Dopont Guy Collective. You know, Dopont Guy meaning Grand Avenue. And we had a weekly program in which I wrote a lot of the scripts on Asian America. So it was part of the movement to have community programs. And so there was a lot going on. It was kind of you know, the beginning of organizations.
Did you feel like you were part of a movement?
Oh, it was totally. Okay. We felt very empowered. We felt very powerful. I mean, our group, and Christopher Chow, the first Asian American journalist on a broadcast, you know, in the Bay Area, was a person who contacted me and got me involved with this Angel Island movement. And this was what I wanted to talk about was, I guess, working, being a delegate, and showed me something about politics, but I just felt that it was just such an uphill battle for Asians and the civil rights movement in this country. But this amazing thing happened, the discovery of the writing on the walls. And it was by a ranger named Alexander Weiss in 1970, who contacted George Araki, professor of biology at San Francisco State, who immediately said, "There's writing on the wall. There's, and Weiss didn't know if it was Chinese or Japanese, and George Araki remembered his grandmother telling him her first steps on Angel Island, first steps in America were on Angel Island, and at that time they thought that the barracks were going to be demolished. And it was because Alexander Weiss was a newly assigned, and he was told by his superiors, "Don't forget about that. That building is going to be demolished. We're ready to get rid of it. It's an old building. It's dilapidated, and it's the site of the old immigration station. And there's no other. That old immigration station burned years ago, but that building stayed there with the writing. But nobody looked at it until that. So George Araki contacted his friend Matt Takahashi, who's a photographer. And George and his family, his wife and 3 kids, and the photographer, and taken to Angel Island by, a ferry to look at the barracks, guided by Alexander Weiss, who had permission to do this. And they photographed every inch, with the children holding the cables. They photographed every inch of the barracks that had writing. And so here you have photographs, and here you have a professor at San Francisco State, you have students, you have activists. The word spread. And Chris Chow was one of the activists, and he called me, and he said, "We've got to do something, and I think we have a plan. We have to form a committee." And so we got a historian, Mark Lai, Phil Choi. I was the only woman on the committee. About 10 of us, and then George Araki, and then, but it was an Asian American, to stop the barracks, because Chinese were detained in that building, but Japanese had gone through as well, and a lot of them were deported. But so how are we going to do this? And Chris Chow says we have to go through the system. We have to contact the assemblyman for our district, who is John Ferran, to write a resolution to create our committee. And it was called first ASHAC, the Angel Island Immigration Station Citizens Advisory Committee, to write a report to submit, but it stopped the demolition of the barracks. It passed. And when that happened, I was just like, not only did it pass, I was involved with helping to write the report, which came out in 1976, and the recommendation to the state to restore the building and to have it preserved as a state monument and later a national monument. And if you see it now, there's another building, there's a hospital that is now a museum to immigration, all immigration, of the history of immigration. And so, and then there's it's just a beautiful monument. And then people can go look at the barracks and look at the writing on the wall. And then in 1982, we had the commemoration of the 100th anniversary of the Chinese exclusion law at Angel Island. And I was part of that. And so it was to me, it was the best use of my ability as a writer, and I guess as an advocate, speaker, activist. I felt that this was my role, that this I could do. And the fact that was to be part of a movement, part of this committee that actually saved this building with the writing on the wall by detainees. And they were activists in writing. They were, when you think about it, they were writing for people to see their plight. They were writing, expressing the injustice of this, and their, so anyway, that's, I would say that's the most exciting and probably the most successful advocacy movement, I've ever been in.
Wow.
Yeah. And it continues because I'm part of the foundation. I mean, I support it and love to continue telling the descendant stories. And then the descendant stories continue to be told. So this was an exhibit at the California History Center, and it's the story of my grandmother detained at Liberty's door. And here I'm using both sides of my family, these stories. My mother told me about her mother being detained on Angel Island. So it brought back her emotions and her feelings about, and the injustice of it all, that she, being American born, could land, and her siblings, but her mother, who was born in China, had to stay on the island. And also the fact that there was a law saying a widow loses the status of her husband. Talk about the injustice of that. And this is part of and I wrote with Barry Fong a video called Detained at Liberty's Door. So it's a story, it's on a video. So it's very gratifying to be able to use my abilities as an activist and a writer, to recover this history and to make a difference, because we feel if people understand this history, if people grasp it and understand why there's anti-Asian hate, why of course, this came out during the pandemic, how you see rallies, with people holding signs saying, stop anti-Asian hate, and then somebody had a sign saying, Executive Order 9066 Angel Island, just to show that these were institutionalized racist episodes in American history that are embedded in our psyche, and so that's what I keep talking about. That's what that's my narrative. And
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I just wanted to build off of that, like talking about your narrative. I guess we're really curious about when you, as a writer, as someone who's literally been creating this narrative, from something that didn't exist before. Is there anything that you think about when you tell a story? Are things that you leave out? Are there things that you keep in when you're going through these historical archives? How do you go about crafting a narrative from these, I guess historical artifacts?
I think that the narrative starts with the people. And so I forgot to mention, the biggest thing that is ongoing, talk about, the things I'm continually doing, is a story of San Jose's Chinatowns. Because this is an incredible story that happened here. And it was completely not even forgotten. It was just obliterated until the excavation for the building of the Fairmont Hotel. It is urban renewal that has, what do you call it? Projects like building a hotel that take excavation and an EIR process. And so in the 1980s, the archaeologists, the wonderful archaeologists, uncovered, and that's because they had to for the EIR process, a complete Chinatown that was burned to the ground on May 4th, 1887. And talking about connections, I grew up knowing about this because my grandfather told me about how he'd run to the Chinatown was home base, and his home base was burned when he was a teenager, and that's why he went to San Francisco to work until he was able to come back to a new Chinatown. But that whole story is a story that happened throughout California. However, it has a very dramatic ending, or continuance. Digging to Chinatown talks about how, the Market Street Chinatown was which is where the City Hall, which is where the Fairmont Hotel was burned by arson, and it's an arson fire. So that's part of the story that I want to emphasize. So this leads to this, the apology by the city of San Jose. And this came about because of the years of history, the years of the archaeology, the years of after the Market Street Chinatown was, the collection, the archaeological collections at Stanford University is being studied. So there's all these studies going on about the Chinatown. It's part of history now. And the excavation for this area called the Corp Yard in Japantown. The Corp Yard was the site of Heinleinville Chinatown. And the struggle to build that Chinatown is part of the story. It's the heart of the story that I want to tell. And I'm going to mention this, not only mention it, but present it at the Rural Chinatowns Conference, that this situation was very unusual, and the story is from the people and also archival research. My father always talked about the Chinatown that he was born in, and he also that had a fence around it, and he goes, so nobody could get in, no one could get out, and we just knew why, because it's a segregated community. John Heinlein, who within 10 days of the fire, he was a friend to the Chinese, and my father on tape said Heinlein loved the Chinese. He leased land to the Chinese, and after the arson fire, and the newspapers called it a mysterious fire, the Chinese said it was deliberately set to chase us out. They knew it because there was already an injunction for that condemned Chinatown because they wanted to build a city hall there. So John Heinlein signed a contract within 10 days with the Chinese merchants, 11 Chinese merchants, to build a new Chinatown on his pasture land, which is the site of Japantown now. And this story tells how the struggle it took, because the city immediately would not give him a permit and had an injunction against him. There was a homeowners association, that had a torchlight parade, against John Heinlein to prevent him from, no Chinatown, no more Chinatowns in San Jose. But he stood his ground. He had, fortunately, had his son, Goethe. Heinlein was a lawyer from San Francisco, came and went to court and defended his father and the Chinese. And the thing is, what is important to know is the Chinese refused to be driven out. They said, we're going to fight this. We're not going to be driven out. And so this is a little bit different, not a little bit, but it's different from other Chinatowns where the violence just drove the Chinese out and they couldn't come back. And there wasn't any benevolent landowner who said, I'll lease land to you. So I think that because of John Heinlein and because of the Chinese not refusing to leave, San Jose stands as one of the communities, that has a story of pride instead of like Tacoma, where it's just so shameful and so hideous, that it will never be forgotten. This community and my father talked about growing up in a wonderful community, going to a school that was integrated, and how John Heinlein leased land to the Japanese, and he had Japanese friends, and then because of the Chinese exclusion law, a Chinatown is a home base for workers. And because of the Chinese exclusion law, and there are no more new workers coming in, the Chinatowns faded. Every store would represent a clan, or they had no more. They didn't have business, and they didn't have their associations, and so, and then were able to have symbiotic relations with the Japanese, who also would buy from their stores, and also they would print up the lottery tickets for their gambling. But Chinatown faded. It was demolished in 1931. But the few remaining Chinese, like my parents, like my grandparents and my father and his brother, they moved across the street into a street that had Japanese. And so there were several, so that became, to me, the first Asian American community in Santa Clara County. And there are Asians, Filipino, Chinese, Japanese. And so, and that existed until, and predominantly Japanese, until Executive Order 9066. And so that's another story.
How did you start documenting the Chinatowns and writing about Highlandville, or that was after the Angel Island work?
Yes.
So probably just a few years after that, or?
Quite a few years.
Okay.
It was like a decade. Oh, yeah, quite a few. Oh.
And you knew this was something historic? That.
Well, I lived I'm in Santa Clara County, and I was involved with Asian Americans for Community Involvement, ACCI. I was one of the founders in 1973. I became less active, but I joined it because I was an activist at that time, and I was on the media committee and worked with textbooks. And I felt that my job with that organization was sort of done. I always supported it. It became wonderful, great, big community service organization. But it certainly had all the connections with Asian Americans, and their needs. And so I always stayed involved, and in fact, I was involved with the first, it was a survey research project when the that led to, it was a mental health study, Asian mental health studies. It was for Cambodians, Vietnamese. It was for the refugees, and this report came out in 1983, and I started work on it. I was part of the survey. I was writing up the survey and managing the office, and it was my first. That was a very, very revealing, kind of. It really shook me up, to actually hear the interviews of Cambodian refugees, Vietnamese, and through translators, and what they call the ethnic Chinese, the boat people. So that research led to a grant that later became administered by ACCI, and that's so. But it was Santa Clara County's mental health study, and the chief investigator was Dr. Kenneth Meinhardt. So, and I worked with Asian American translators. Well, they were immigrants, and then they would, tell me the stories in the survey, and then we just writing up the report and seeing there was another wave of Asians coming in with incredible needs, who had suffered so much during the wars, and they were truly refugees. And it was just, so it's just realizing that it continues. Our our immigration story continues, and having Asian Americans, in positions where they can, help, be it, and be, make a difference in a big way, like, Aki and, the administrators and the psychologists and the social workers, but they had to be Asian Americans. It was really, so.
How did you start writing or doing research on the Chinatowns, and how was it received initially?
Initially it was the writing about the Chinatown. As soon as the book came out, it was very, very well received. It was welcome because it documented, and that at that time, this organization started, the CHCP, the Chinese Historical and Cultural Project, and that was a very major history park. I mean, where you're actually going to have a museum devoted to this story of the Chinatowns in Santa Clara County. And so first it was called the Gong, the Temple of Five Gods, and it's a replica building in History Park, and it has exhibits, and it has a video called Chinatown as Home Base, which tells the story. It was done by Jessica Yu, my daughter, filmmaker, and she did it in 1990 when she was still able to interview people who had lived and who grew up in Heinleinville, and wonderful stories. My father had passed on then, but we located several of his friends who gave interviews, who grew up with him. So it's a very short film, but it tells about, it begins with the burning of the Chinatown, Mark Street, and the story of John Heinlein. And she did a lot of research. Jessica and I were actually researching from the same archives. At that time, the History San Jose, it was called the San Jose Historical Museum, and the archives were actually there. And so it was just amazing that when I talked to, I needed documentation. I needed, I'd love to see a certificate of residence from San Jose. This is my grandfather when he was living in San Francisco. Leslie Matsunaga opened a file, and she had a stack of these. And certificate of residence of Chinese that were forced to have a photo ID because they were Chinese. And she just said, okay, take your pick for your book. And I was just like in awe. And then I also found a receipt. And my mother was alive at that time. She could help me. She could read Chinese. The receipt was in a file, and it was a $1 donation to the Chinese 6 companies to fight the Geary Act. Because this shows resistance, and this is what I do want to talk about at this conference, is that the Chinese did not take the violence and the repression, without protest. So the Chinese did not register until 1894. All the certificates are 1894 because the 6 companies took the case to the Supreme Court, Fong Yuting versus U.S., and they lost. They were challenging the constitutionality of the Chinese exclusion law. So from my mother's giving me this document, I was able to connect it, because I looked at the document. I didn't know about the resistance movement and everything. I just said, and then I was able to understand it and attach a real feeling to this. And then to see so many other certificates, even of children, native-born children had to register. And so, as I said, when I did the research, I'd always connected to people. And the one thing about Asian exclusion, there's a paper trail. You can go to Nara and you could see a file on your ancestor who was detained on Angel Island, or whose ancestor was questioned. It's all there. and then the paper trail of these documents. That's the only benefit of all this horrific, legislation and anti-Asian sensibility, so.
What do you think is the significance of finding this like historical resistance? Like, what do you think the consequences of that are? Like, why is that important?
The importance of finding the incidents of resistance and documentation of resistance is incredibly important because it gives humanity to the people. It gives their dignity and it tells a story of their character. The Chinese, and this is from fairly recent research, the Stanford Chinese Railroad Workers Project, started by Gordon Chang and Shelley Fishkin. They documented incidents of many incidents on the railroad, but of the strike. The Chinese struck for better wages, better conditions, 8 hours a day. They lost, but they did it, and they took risks to do it. And it's just incredibly, I just said, how brave. And they also felt they had a chance. And they did win some concessions later, but the fact that they struck, and also it was their dignity. And also it showed some unity. There was a lot of solidarity with this movement. How can you get thousands of people not to register and risk jail, but say, we will take it to court, and then when they failed, there was such a rush to register in 1894. So, yeah, and I wanted to hear from my father. I wanted to hear how my grandfather was a community leader. He was every store was, headquarters for a clan. That's where the workers from that district would come and get their mail. And so my grandfather was he was a leader of the group, but also he was a follower of Sun Yat-sen, the revolutionary leader. And that, I wanted to tell that story because it shows that the Chinese had political leanings, and they did believe in the principles of democracy and the three principles. Of the people, for the people, by the people. That was the slogan of Sun Yat-sen too. And he succeeded, his revolution succeeded, and he was in Denver raising funds in 1911 when the war was there. But, my grandfather had kept a lot of records, and some of them, his papers, my father donated to the Hoover Institute. My father graduated from Stanford. He was always very, very proud of defending Stanford for hiring so many Chinese, because he said he gave them jobs, and true, and a foothold in America. So it was just, in fact, that's probably the most exciting thing when I found there were strikes in the wine country of Chinese workers. They were united. And most of the time they failed. But they made a stand, and for the Big Four, when the Chinese struck, and what was it, after they got through the Sierras, it struck fear in their hearts because they didn't want to lose their labor force. And Crocker just said, well, I'll handle them, and I'll stop the butchers from butchering meat, and we'll starve them out. And so they had to, but he was shaken up, and they did make some concessions later, according to the studies, that they didn't want to admit it. But, and also, showing that the Chinese kept their customs, and the temple meant so much to them. And they would have their parades, and they'd just be out there. And there's a picture of the parade, the famous parade of Daju, the Feast of the Hundred Ghosts. The Chinese are marching outside the fence. showing the community, this is our solemn festival. They were getting respect. And actually, when Sun Yat-sen succeeded in establishing the Republic of China in 1911, the U.S. government was a lot more respectful of the Chinese. And that did come down locally to, and the Chinatown in San Jose was considered a place that people can go and look at festivities. They didn't go to shop, but they go. The Chinese are having their Chinese festival, and the cover of my book shows, is from a newspaper article of my grandmother and my father as a little boy with the Chinese flag and my uncle with the American flag. So, and every parade had a Chinese, the flag of the temple, but in front was the American flag. So there was that sense of really trying to establish we are an American community that's Chinese. So, and the legacy that I'll be talking about and working with the JAMS, Japanese American Museum in San Jose, is tours and exhibits to show what this community of Japantown, which is called Japantown, what it really is, what it stands for, and the history behind it, and how it has become this community for all peoples. But the roots are an Asian American community that came out of struggle, out of prejudice. I mean, when I interviewed Dr. Ishikawa, he was one of the oldest residents of Japantown, born in one of the buildings that's Nisei, community center. No, it's Issei. Anyway, on 5th Street. So I talked to him about, growing up in Chinatown, in Japantown. And he said, we came here, the Japanese came here because the Chinese were here. And he was saying, there's nowhere else that would take us in. There's nowhere else to go. We came here and we were able to have a community, and we were able to live together. And he said there was a mailman named Frank Brown, and my father talked about him a lot. He was a mailman for the two communities. He would go from Chinatown to Japantown, and my father said he spoke a few words of Chinese, and he was very, very nice to all of the residents. And Dr. Ichikawa said that, we really missed him when he retired. And my mother would always give him gifts because he would be one of the two white witnesses that was required to testify, for the residency or the citizenship or the birth certificate for the residents of Japantown and Chinatown. And I always wonder how he got the mail delivered on time because he, was so busy. So Dr. Ichikawa said that he didn't have a birth certificate. And so the mailman testified, that he always saw the family here and, that kind of thing. So, and I have in going to the archives, there are a lot of merchant documents, and my grandfather was able to become a merchant, change his status. And two white witnesses. One was Frank Brown, is he really a merchant? Is he always at this store? And, have you ever seen him working in the fields? And then the other one was Charlie Senkel, who was a night watchman for Highlandville. The Chinese had to hire a night watchman. And then my father said the gates were never closed in his lifetime. So they were locked in the beginning. When Heinlein, built it, because he was afraid that while he was building it, having it built, he was afraid that people, and he had barbed wire on this is according to the newspapers, on top of the fence, because he was afraid that people would come over and burn down this Chinatown, because there were so many threats. He was threatened. The Chinese were threatened while during building. So it took a lot of courage and a lot of faith to stay. And then over the years, they overcame. They were accepted. And the Japantown was accepted also until Executive Order 9066.
To what extent do you feel like these stories have reached even the area of people here, either children in schools around here or residents? Who knows how widespread
Who
do you
knows
think
about
these?
it?
Yeah.
Well, I think that everybody, well, nationally, San Jose, at that time, the 10th largest city in the United States, officially apologized for injustices to Chinese, historic injustices. And so Jerry Wang and I were called to Raul Perales' office to discuss having an apology at an event. And being a historian, they talked about how we're going to write the resolution. I ended up writing there are 12 whereas clauses. There are so many whereas clauses. And it starts with, the early anti-Chinese movement and the fact that an anti-Chinese convention was held in San Jose, and then the burning of the Chinatown, and then continue ordinances against, it just go on and on and on and on and on. And then the struggle to build the Chinatown, and then so the resolution ends with, "Be it therefore resolved that we move forward for justice for all." So, but it was exciting to be part of that, and that was part of my, again, one of the things that I very, very excited to be able to do that would make a difference, I think, because the resolution was passed by the council. It was September 2021, and then the next day we had a big ceremony right at near the Market Street area. It's right in front of the museum. In front of the palms, beautiful area, and there's a lion dance and a big audience canopy, and it was just a very joyful. To me, it was like an act of grace to have a resolution, and everybody, great publicity. It was on CNN. They did several reports on it, local news, but nationally, and so I felt that, it's very hard to have any lasting impact, but we felt that locally, for our city, we felt we did it, it's done, we established this, and then I gave each, so there were several speakers. Jerry spoke, Evan Lowe, Otto Lee, and then I spoke also, and I gave the story. So mine was the history of why this, starting with Market Street, Chinatown, my whole family, and why it's important. But I also announced that there will be a park at the site of the Chinatown, and it would be called Highlandville Park. So, in the park. So here's what I feel. I don't feel really done, but this is as much as I can do at the site. Tamako Ross, incredible graphic designer and historian, activist historian, and she did the design for the history wall and the medallions, and I did the text. And the text is written in stone, the history of this site, beginning with a land acknowledgement, and then Chinese workers in the fields, and then goes on and on and on, and covers the Filipino community, and then the Japanese coming back to rebuild, and then ending with the apology. So
I'm curious why you think, or you said that this might not have a lasting impact, or it's such a struggle to have a lasting impact. Like, what do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, look at the politics in our country. I feel that there's because the lasting impact has to be national. You know, California's, well, I would say our area is pretty liberated and liberal, you know, and understands it because of our population. Look at our demographics. But you go to another area, say, you know, in Arkansas or some, you know, where I know some people recently, Asians, have been told to go back to where they came from. So I feel that and also the resistance of the Republicans and the white supremacy movement, which is always there. It's always there. It's always there. You know, the attack on the Capitol, and the fact that it could happen again, and the fact that we have a candidate that Trump's never going to back down on, and in fact go continuing just as, you know, a convicted felon, and the fact that he's embraced by the Republican Party, embracing the racism, the pushback, Wade versus Roe, and any changes in the curriculum of schools. Remember, they said we want the real history of America to be taught, the real history, the white history. So I just feel we're on the cusp of something, you know? It's very scary. It's a very scary time.
For all the work that you've done in kind of promoting people understanding, you know, these counter narratives, of historical counter narratives that you've done, what do you think happens when people don't know this history, you know, the history of what you're talking about in terms of Chinese exclusion, Chinese immigration, Pan-Asian solidarity, Asian American movement, you know, incarceration during World War II. What do you think happens when people don't know this history?
When people do not know the history of the struggles and of Asian Americans, I feel it's the end of democracy. I think that it's the end of democracy because it's rejecting a people. It's rejecting any progress that we've made. It's the ignorance would be, well, you know, again, it goes back to institutionalizing racism. I think that we're rolling back, you know. I mean, look at the you know what somebody said, a legislator, if you can take away Roe versus Wade, you can take away anything, you know, anything, all of it. I mean, Brown versus education, you know, okay, it's mainly in establishing our narrative that's accepted. You know, that's why stories are so important. You know, what is so amazing is only a few years ago was it known to the public about the Tulsa massacre, where a whole large African American community was devastated, eradicated, bombed upon in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And they start interviewing the very, very elderly few survivors. And they said, you know, we tried to tell our stories, that, you know, we must tell our stories. And how long has it taken? So anyway, I think that we keep doing it, and we're hoping for the best. Election will make a difference. It will make a difference if Biden wins.
I have a question, kind of a last question. Do
Yeah.
you want to have anything else? Or?
I guess I kind of have a question that maybe I can just like say, which is, and maybe this is like actually in conversation with their last interview, Tom Izu and Susan Hayase, one of their narratives that they kind of push was to, quote unquote, prevent the Japanese American community from shifting to the right. And you mentioned also that there's a sense of, maybe like Republicans pushing a certain narrative that like goes against what you're trying to show. And my question is, you also mentioned that your father was a Republican.
Yes.
I was wondering, like, how do you reconcile all these
well,
contradictions?
he was a different Republican, and when it came to voting for Reagan, he couldn't do it.
Oh.
He voted for Anderson. He couldn't do it. So he voted for independent. In other words, the Republicans of the past are different.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why a lot of them, people in the old days, became Republicans, it was the party of Lincoln.
Mm-hmm.
And they felt, my father always felt they were better, nicer toward Chinese, because of the Democrats at that time, the people's, sort of the populace,
Mm-hmm.
So, I can reconcile that. I think that it'd be just incredible if there was a contingent of Republicans that are Asian, advocating for Trump. I mean, that'd be, yeah. I think they'd have to be very quiet. Just like I think that being here, we have a responsibility. Being in Santa Clara County, having the opportunity to do what you're doing. It's a huge responsibility, and we have to work really hard. We have to take it seriously. You do, of course. And I think that we have to just go to the max on this. No holds barred. Tell the story.
Maybe just to close, a question for you, which is, looking back at all the efforts you've been involved in and all the historical moments and I guess a lot of strategizing too and a lot of energy put in. What are some of the major lessons that you have learned as an activist?
As an activist, get as many allies as you can. And you have to, this is well, it's been very good. And because I think, we're having Asian Americans in office. I think ACCI started to try to get people on boards, to try to, to change things. So I think that the lessons learned where you have to be part of the political system. You have to be part of the community. You cannot be outside without following through. And the only way to follow through is through, participation, through legislation, So, and like they say, the ballot box did not stop the Vietnam War, but the demonstrations did. So you still have to have the activism that is so, and the sacrifice of people. Like the Vietnamese American writer, Viet Thanh Nguyen, he's standing shoulder to shoulder with students. He's a faculty member, and he demonstrated when he was a student at UC Berkeley. And here he is as a professor at USC standing with students who might very well get arrested, and he with them. But I just think, it's a real, that was very inspiring to me. And it's unfortunate, you have to do that. You have to take risk. So you have to have everything. Because people, if it weren't for, you think there'd be a ceasefire agreement even if the students didn't protest and the communities everywhere did not protest. So, anyway.
Thank you.
Everyone fight on. Solidarity forever,
Thank you so
thank
much.
you so much.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thanks. That was great.
Great.
Yeah.